Egypt with a next door neighbor who is a good neighbor. They're friends of mine, but they happened to build a dam which closed up water going into a thing called the Nile. I think if I'm Egypt, I want to have water in the Nile, and we're working on that one. It's a problem, but it's going to get solved. They built one of the biggest dams in the world, a little bit outside of Egypt. You know about that? You've been hearing about that one. And that turned out to be a big problem. I don't know. I think the United States funded the dam. I don't know why they didn't solve the problem before they built the dam. But it's nice when the Nile River has water. It's a very important source of income and life. It's the life of Egypt. And to take that away is pretty incredible. But we think we're going to have that solved very quickly.
So a major project. But what about the funding source? The U.S. claim.
Right. So when you look into the financing, there's really no credible evidence backing up the idea that the U.S. funded this dam.
No evidence.
None that holds up. The real story of how it was paid for is, well, quite different. And honestly, pretty interesting.
Okay.
The dam has been funded almost entirely by Ethiopian sources.
Ethiopian sources? How? For such a big project.
Well, a lot was raised domestically. They used these things called diaspora bonds.
Yes, I've heard of those, selling bonds to citizens abroad.
Exactly. Leveraging that connection. There was a big one back in 2011, for example. Plus, huge public contributions from Ethiopians inside the country.
So a real national effort.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Now, other international lenders have played a part, sure, but not the U.S. government providing the main funding for construction.
I feel it coming. I feel it coming, baby. I feel it coming. I feel it coming, baby.
We are going to be signing numerous countries in the not too distant future, so that'll be great. While you are on the phone, could I ask you, how is the dam doing in Ethiopia? The largest dam in many, many years being built. Unfortunately, it stops water from flowing into the Nile, which causes Egypt a little bit of a problem, right? As it should. But Ethiopia built a dam. You know all about it probably, Bibi, but I've been dealing with Sudan on that. And I'm just curious, how is that going? Because you're really the third party involved with Ethiopia and Egypt and the dam. Are they working out their deal? Because I had a deal done for them. And then unfortunately, Ethiopia broke the deal, which they should not have done. That was a big mistake. And we've stopped payment to them of a lot of aid because they did it. And they will never see that money unless they adhere to the agreement. But they built a dam which stops water from flowing into the Nile. And you can't blame Egypt for being a little bit upset. Yeah, if you would, because I had a deal done and then they broke the deal, and they can't do that. They can't do that. So the deal was done, and it's a very dangerous situation because Egypt is not going to be able to live that way. And they'll end up blowing up the dam, and I said it, and I say it loud and clear, they'll blow up that dam, and they have to do something.
Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses.
The EU has announced a 7.4 billion aid package for Egypt. The EU fears that economic pressure, war and chaos in neighbouring countries could lead to mass migration to the country. The package is expected to be signed during a visit to Cairo by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other European leaders.
The partnership between the European Union and Egypt is of critical importance. The presence of 6 European leaders today shows how deeply we value our relationship. We share strategic interests in stability and prosperity.
The package includes loans dispersed over 3 years for the Arab world's most populous country. But the aid package is not good news for everyone. Amnesty International has warned Egypt will have to be scrutinised to ensure it adopts measures in line with EU human rights and freedom of expression standards.
Egypt and Ethiopia, as you know, they've been fighting over the dam. Ethiopia built the dam with United States money, largely. It's one of the largest dams in the world, and it has one little problem. It doesn't allow much water going into the Nile River. So you can imagine Egypt's not thrilled because they live off the Nile River. The Nile River is its blood, its heart, it's everything. And we think we have that one pretty well taken care of. But that was a pretty bad watching this as it was going up, pictures and satellites and everything, and I'm looking at this massive dam. I'm saying, is that going to be blocking the water to the Nile? And anyway, that should have never sort of happened the way it happened. But financed by the United States of America. It's a little crazy, but we got that solved. I think it's going to be solved pretty long term. We have, let's see, Cambodia, Armenia, we have Kosovo, Serbia, Israel, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia. That's a beauty. They built a little dam in Ethiopia that's like the largest dam in the world. And it affects the water going to the Nile. Would you say that's a problem? I would say that's a big problem.
הנה ראש ממשלת אתיופיה בא ואומר, אני אלך לזה, ההסכמים הם ישנים ולא צודקים.
I know that some people in Egypt have old-fashioned ideas that the Nile water belongs to Egypt and that Egypt has a right to decide as to who gets what. These circumstances have changed and changed forever. Ethiopia is still poor, but it is able to cough up the necessary resources to build whatever infrastructure and dams it wants on the Nile waters. Egypt will not be able to stop Ethiopia from building dams on the Nile. That is history. The way forward is not for Egypt to try and stop the unstoppable.
סכסוכים, בהחלט, סכסוכים במזרח התיכון תמיד הם על שטח או על דת. מים זה מעין, נכון, גם מים, אבל זה מעין כמו איזה...
Well, thank you very much. A friend of mine is, he was a great general, he's a great president, and it's an honor to have him. And Mr. President, we have a lot to talk about, so I thought maybe the press might want to ask us a couple of questions after you say a few words. But we had a wonderful time, and I think we've made a lot of progress so far in Switzerland, in Davos. Made a speech, it's being reviewed quite nicely. And we have a fantastic relationship with Egypt, and the president will call and ask for things, and we always are able to work it out. But the relationship's been very strong right from the beginning, from years ago. So I want to thank you very much. Please. Well, thank you very much. They're talking about the dam that's been built in Ethiopia. It's one of the largest dams in the world, the largest dam in Africa, but it's one of the largest dams anywhere in the world. It was financed by the United States, and it basically blocks the Nile River. You know, when I think of Egypt, I think about the Nile more than any other place, in all fairness, but it goes through Ethiopia. And a dam was built, a very big one, very, very big one, massive. And it was something that should have been talked about a long time ago when they were building it and financing it. So I got involved at the end of my first term, and I was going to have a deal. We were going to have pretty close to a deal. Then we had a rigged election, and I left, and of course Biden didn't do anything about it because he didn't know he was alive. And here I come back, and it's become a very dangerous issue, the dam, and I'll see if I can get that back on track. We were all set to make a deal. We're going to do a joint venture of sorts, and it would have been good. I think it would have been good for both. But it's a dangerous thing. They built a dam where somebody's not getting the water that they are supposed to get and that they've gotten for 1 million years, and all of a sudden the water flow is blocked by a very massive dam. I wouldn't be happy about it. And, you know, you have a very strong leader in the president, and I hear you have a strong leader in Ethiopia, too. I don't know him as well as I know you, but he's a strong guy. And I'm going to try bringing the two of you together, see if we can make a deal.
The forgotten cries of Ethiopia, a nation bleeding in silence. In the heart of the Horn of Africa, a silent genocide unfolds. Ethiopia, a nation known for its ancient civilization, its cultural heritage, and its proud history of independence, is today drowning in rivers of blood. Villages are razed, children starve, women are violated, and communities vanish overnight. Yet the world looks away. The same international institutions that speak loudly about human rights in public forums whisper nothing when it comes to Ethiopia's pain. The genocide in Ethiopia is not new. It is a continuation of decades of ethnic tension, political corruption, and the thirst for absolute power. But since the outbreak of the Tigray conflict in late 2020, the violence has reached unimaginable levels. What began as a political dispute between the central government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, has turned into a brutal war against entire populations. Civilians have become targets. Reports from Tigray, Amhara, Oromia, and Afar regions describe scenes that echo Rwanda's dark history of 1994, massacres, systematic rape used as a weapon of war, forced starvation, and mass graves. Satellite images confirm burned villages. Witnesses recount how ethnic minorities are hunted down, how the elderly are left to die without food or medicine, and how hospitals are destroyed deliberately. The world has been here before. We said, never again. Yet again it is happening, and again no one moves. A state of hunger and desperation. Millions are now displaced, living in makeshift camps where disease and famine kill more than bullets. Aid organizations are blocked from entering certain zones, journalists are silenced, and the government continues to deny responsibility. In some regions, hunger itself has become a weapon, food withheld as punishment for belonging to the wrong ethnicity. Children's bodies, thin as paper, tell a story of cruelty beyond words. International relief agencies have repeatedly warned that Ethiopia faces one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. Yet global leaders respond with empty statements. The United Nations issues concerns. The European Union threatens sanctions. The African Union calls for dialogue. But none of this stops the killing. None of this brings justice. The media's complicity through silence. Perhaps one of the most shameful aspects of this tragedy is the silence of the Western media. The same networks that dedicate endless coverage to wars in Europe offer only seconds, if any, to the agony of Ethiopians. When black lives are destroyed in Africa, they are treated as statistics, not as human beings. This selective empathy, this hierarchy of suffering, is racism hidden under diplomatic language. The Western press talks endlessly about defending democracy, but ignores when democratic principles are crushed in Africa. Why? Because Ethiopia has no oil to sell, no strategic military bases to offer, and no white population to make headlines relatable. The suffering of Africans has been normalized, accepted as part of a continent of crises. That normalization is part of the genocide itself. The government's crimes and global hypocrisy. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed once received the Nobel Peace Prize for ending war with Eritrea. Today that same peace laureate stands accused of war crimes. His government's forces alongside Eritrean troops have been implicated in atrocities too horrific to describe. Massacres in Aksum, mass rapes in Tigray, executions in Amhara. The international community gave him a prize, then gave him weapons. Western governments continue to provide aid to a regime that uses hunger and terror as political tools. China and Russia, eager to expand their influence, supply military equipment and political cover. The African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, remains silent, afraid to criticize one of its own. This is not diplomacy, it is complicity. Every dollar sent to this government, every silence from a world leader, every muted headline, all of it fuels the genocide. Where is humanity? Where are the human rights defenders who claim to speak for justice? Where are the global protests that fill streets when other wars erupt? Where is the outrage, the moral clarity, the compassion? Ethiopia's children deserve the same attention, the same humanity as any other child in this world. This is not about politics anymore. It is about survival, about whether we, as a global society, will allow another genocide to unfold under our watch. The blood of Tigrayans, Amharas, all of them, cries out from the soil of Ethiopia. Call to action. The genocide in Ethiopia must stop. Now. The international community must impose a total arms embargo on all warring parties. Independent investigators must be granted unrestricted access to all regions. Humanitarian aid must flow freely. Perpetrators, no matter how powerful, must face international justice. Silence is no longer an option. To ignore this genocide is to participate in it. Every voice matters. Journalists, activists, politicians, citizens. If we remain indifferent, we are no better than the hands that pull the trigger. Conclusion. Ethiopia's tragedy is not only an African story, it is a human story, a mirror reflecting our collective failure to defend life when it is most vulnerable. The genocide must end, and the world must finally learn that no nation's suffering is worth less than another's. Justice delayed is justice denied. And Ethiopia has waited long enough.
So another prophecy that we haven't talked about it's really important is Isaiah 19. I'm sure you're familiar, Al-Fadi, with something called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Yes.
So this is something, obviously, for anyone who's been paying attention to the Middle East or North Africa, geopolitical issues, particularly in Egypt, really over the past several years, there's been this massive project that they've been working, and they've just completed it, called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. It's down there on the border of Sudan and Ethiopia at the base of the Nile. So basically the idea was, the Africans in Sudan and Ethiopia, they said, look, the Nile belongs to all of us. It doesn't just belong to Egypt. The Nile is ours as well. And the Egyptians, of course, in the 70s and 80s built the Aswan Dam, one of the greatest sort of engineering marvels of modern history, but it went on to become one of the greatest ecological failures of modern history. And so obviously the land of Egypt, everything revolves around the Nile. The Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt. Egypt, of course, is the most populous Arab nation in the world. They're growing faster than Bitcoin. I remember being there a few years ago, and there's this big countdown clock in Cairo. Not a countdown clock, a count up clock. And it's literally just like every birth in Cairo. And it's just shooting up. Well, that was 85 million. And just a few years later, we're over 100 million. So, far and away, the most populous Arab nation in the world. And it all relies on the Nile. Every year the Nile, for thousands, right? Like as old as human history, the Nile would flood. And when it does so, it brings all of this rich, dark fertilizer and silt. And then you have all of the agriculture in Egypt and so forth. Everything from the sardine industry and, there's so much industry, the flax and the cotton and all of these things, everything revolves around the Nile. Okay, so we have this prophecy, Isaiah 19, and a lot of people miss the importance of it, but I think it's really relevant to some events that are unfolding right now. As I said, they just finished the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. I mentioned the Aswan Dam. When they built that, they thought, we'll save all this, we'll have all this electrical energy that it will be produced and so forth. But basically what it did is in Lake Nasser, all of this rich fertilizer and silt, it was basically just building up back there. All the water is just being desiccated in the hot desert heat. And so they now have, the Nile is depleted, a bit from what it used to be. It's had a really negative ecological impact. Well, now they've just completed this other massive dam at the basin of the Nile, and they're just filling it now. It takes years to fill. We don't know what the long-term ecological impact is going to be on Egypt. Again, like you think of what happened a few years ago, al-Fadi, with the Syrian civil war and, just a few million Syrians flooding into Europe and the turmoil that caused for Europe. Well, imagine if something happened in Egypt and instead of 2 or 3 or 4 million, let's say you had 25 million refugees pouring into Europe. So this is kind of what we're talking about. So Isaiah 19, it starts out, it says, the oracle concerning Egypt, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and he is coming to Egypt. Now, there's a lot of biblical backstory to this statement. Throughout the Bible, Yahweh is framed as the one who rides on the clouds. He's the cloud rider. Right. And it says no one else rides on the clouds. There's no one else like Yahweh who rides on the clouds. Like that is his title. Baal tried to claim that title. He claimed to be the storm god. And God goes, no. I'm the one who rides on the clouds, as he did throughout the Exodus. And so here's God coming to Egypt. I actually believe this is speaking about the return of Jesus. I actually believe that Jesus, as the greater Moses, actually returns to Egypt, retraces the entire path of the Exodus, and then he will enter the promised land as the returning king. And along the way, he will set Jewish prisoners of war throughout the region free, and he'll liberate prisoners and so forth. So as the Lord comes to Egypt, it says the idols of Egypt are trembling and the hearts of the Egyptians are in terror. And then in verse 2, it says, It's kind of like this. It's like the beginning of a movie. It starts out with the return of Jesus, and then it backs up into the events that lead up to that. That's kind of the way chapter 19 is laid out. And then it starts out with a civil war in Egypt. Not a civil war in Syria, a civil war, as I said, in Egypt. It says, I will stir up Egyptian against Egyptian, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. So civil war, and the Egyptians will lose heart, and I will bring all of their plans to nothing. And then it specifically highlights what is leading to this civil war. It says, the waters from the sea will dry up, the river will become parched and dry, the Nile will be depleted, the Nile will dry up. It says the canals will emit a stench, the streams of Egypt will thin out and dry up, the reeds and the rushes will rot away, the bulrushes by the Nile, by the edge of the Nile, and all of the sown fields by the Nile, they become dry, driven away. The fishermen are lamenting. It's affecting the economy of 100 million people. All those who cast a line into the Nile, those who spread nets, all of the fishermen are depressed. Moreover, it says the manufacturers of linen made from the flax or the Egyptian cotton makers, they're dejected. The pillars of Egypt are shattered. All of the laborers are depressed, they're grieved. There will be no work for Egypt. Okay, so the desolation of its economy, the drying up of the Nile, civil war. And you can see that all of these things could very easily potentially be in Egypt's future. And then it says this in verse 4, and I will hand the Egyptians over to the power of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them. This is talking about the Antichrist. As it says in Daniel 11, which we've talked about a lot in previous sessions, the time is coming when the king of the north from the region of Syria and Turkey, he will actually invade the land of Egypt. In Daniel 11, it says the Antichrist, or the king of the north, will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. It goes on and it says, when he defeats Egypt, then Libya and Cush will then join him. This is speaking of the series of wars whereby the Antichrist will consolidate regional power as he reestablishes a caliphate throughout the region. And I believe that Isaiah 19 is talking about that. I will hand the Egyptians over to the power of a cruel master, a fierce king. Okay, and then as a result of all of this pain and suffering in Egypt, it says, it will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. This is the beautiful part, Al-Fadi. It says, they will cry out to the Lord because of oppressors or the oppression. So because of all of this difficulty in Egypt, and again, Egypt has one of the largest, it has between Syria and Egypt, the largest Christian population, Arab Christian population in the world, they begin crying out to the Lord. A prayer movement arises. And then the Lord, it says, the Lord will send them a savior and a champion, and he will deliver them. And then as a result of them praying and crying out, thus the Lord of hosts will make himself known to Egypt. And the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. They will even worship the Lord with sacrifice and offering. They'll make a vow to the Lord and keep it. The Lord will strike Egypt. Yes, difficulty is coming to Egypt, but he's also going to heal them. They will return to the Lord and he will heal them. And then it speaks of the age of the Messiah, and it talks about there being this highway between Assyria and Egypt and Israel, and they all worship the Lord together. This is a prophecy which in so many ways we can see being fulfilled in our day. And despite all of the difficulty of the civil war and the drying of the Nile and the desolation of the economy and the invasion of Egypt by the Antichrist, ultimately there will be a strong and mighty people of God, a church in Egypt that will pray and cry out, and the Lord is going to pour out his spirit on Egypt in the days ahead. And so it's a prophecy that's not all bad. It's got a lot of beauty in it as well. And so it's also something that we can be watching and praying into in the midst of all of these things being fulfilled.
Amen, amen. And when you mentioned Libya and Cush, by the way, the thing that came to mind immediately, and maybe you agree or disagree with that, is that there is a common denominator right now if we start looking north, let's say Turkey in this case, and even Syria, and look at what's going on in Libya and in Sudan, Cush. There is a common denominator, Muslim brotherhoods, by the way. And you know that Egypt kind of like tried to purge that power, when Sisi took power. But that doesn't mean they're out of the woods when it comes to the threat itself. So.
Exactly. And also Turkey, which is basically the Turkish branch of Ikhwan, of the Brotherhood, has really done a lot to try to expand its influence and power in Libya and Sudan and Somalia and throughout the region. So it absolutely makes sense that if the Antichrist is in unity with Turkey, that with the defeat of Egypt, that these other Ikhwan, Brotherhood, influence nations would join with Turkey for sure.